Welcome to Wild Turkey Science, a podcast made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow. I'm Dr. Marcus Lashley, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Florida.
And I'm Dr. Will Goolsby, Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at Auburn University. We're both lifelong hunters and devoted scientists who are passionate about hunting, managing, and researching wild turkeys.
In this podcast, we'll explore turkey research, speak to the experts in the field, and address the difficult questions related to wild turkey ecology and management.
Our goal
is to serve as your connection to wild turkey science.
Did you hit record on here?
Is that the red button?
Yeah, that's the one.
Well, so Dr. Byrne, really appreciate you taking some time to come on the show with us. I think we have talked about this before, but I'm pretty sure if it's not the top state in terms of engagement, it's certainly one of the top few, Missouri. And a lot of people are very interested to hear, what kind of work is going on in that state. And we know that you've been around and studying turkeys, for a long time and have done a lot of work. And that was one reason we reached out to you to see if you'd be willing to come on and share some of your ongoing work and anything else you want to talk about, really. But we really appreciate you taking some time to come on and talk to us.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, Mike, will you just explain for our listeners, just real briefly, how you got to the position that you're in now and a little bit about your background?
Yeah, sure. So I am an assistant professor of wildlife ecology at the University of Missouri. Got here in 2017. So the way I got into turkeys was starting my PhD, which I did with Dr. Michael Chamberlain, who, if you haven't had him on, I'm sure you'll have him on probably soon.
We have.
Yep, back at LSU. So I got my PhD working with Mike, studying raccoons. And their kind of spatial ecology in relation to turkey nesting. So like a lot of the work I do is spatial ecology. If I give kind of the elementary school breakdown, I like to capture animals, put tracking devices on them and follow them around to see what they do. So not just with turkeys, I work with all kinds of stuff. I've worked with wolves in Chernobyl. I've got a lot of studies with mako sharks and a bunch of different oceans.
Wow.
That's what I was going to say. I've seen a couple of, I can't remember if it was like a Google Scholar update or something I got recently where I saw you were doing some marine stuff and I was like, well, that's interesting. But I also wasn't surprised because I know how much you like the spatial ecology aspect of it, which, opens up a lot of doors to work with a variety of species.
Yeah. I've been doing shark stuff longer than I've been doing turkey stuff.
Oh, wow.
Actually, yep. So yeah, I love, I like working on the more stuff you can work on, the better. I think I like turkeys. I don't always call myself a turkey person. I call myself a, kind of a vertebrate ecologist. So turkeys are one of the species I work on, along with all the other stuff, which keeps it interesting for me.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting to me as well, that your entry point to doing turkey work is through sharks. I don't know if that's ever happened before. Pretty interesting.
Probably. It's funny. It's like people that don't know me personally, but kind of know my name. From what I can gather, they're either like, oh, the mako shark guy, or oh, the turkey guy, or wait, that's not the Chernobyl guy with the wolves. Just like my life makes no sense.
Yeah.
So when you were hired there at Missouri, was there any expectation? Were they just trying to hire you as a spatial ecologist, or was there an expectation that you would do some turkey work? And I ask that because obviously Missouri has a long, and well-established, well-respected legacy of doing some really great turkey research.
I don't think they were looking for turkeys specifically. I think they were just looking for a wildlife ecologist that could do some basic ecology as well as, work with state agencies and other agencies and do some applied stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And it happened to be that, turkeys are a big deal in Missouri. And I had worked a little bit with the Missouri Department of Conservation, just in other projects I had done before I got here. So I kind of knew some of the people, which may or may not have helped. But I don't think they were looking for a turkey specific person, but I think they were looking for someone who could do wildlife ecology and make at least a portion of it applied and work with the state agencies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. So, you brought up the raccoon thing. That's actually one of the things I wanted to ask you about. I forgot about it though. I'm glad you brought it up. So that was your PhD work on the raccoons?
Yep.
Well, I guess at some point here, I don't know if this is the right time. Maybe since I've brought it up now, it is. Can you tell us a little bit about that project? And what were you trying to figure out, and what was the overarching conclusion? That was years ago, so you published it now. So
Yep, it's all out there, so I can talk about all of it.
yeah,
Yeah, so that project that was in the Atchafalaya Basin in Louisiana. So think of Swamp People or whatever those TV shows were there. So closed canopy, hardwood forest, lots of cypress, lots of flooding, sort of that area. And like a lot of places, people were concerned about, well, we're maybe not seeing the poult per hen ratios we've been seeing. So kind of a background is what might be causing some reproductive declines if that's going on. And people love to blame raccoons for everything turkey related or non-turkey related.
Even with mako sharks?
There's probably, I could probably make the connection somehow.
So the raccoon roundworm is going downstream into the Gulf.
There you go. Yeah, so the idea was, okay, nest predation, obviously always a hot topic when you talk about wild turkey reproduction. And so the idea was, we make a lot of assumptions about nest predation and who's causing it. And so kind of the impetus for this was, well, let's actually track the raccoons simultaneously at like a higher resolution. So this was still back in the days of VHF transmitters, no GPS yet. But I'd radio collar raccoons along with my sample of radio collared turkeys. And during the nesting season at night, I would find one of my raccoons just before it got dark. And then I would basically follow that raccoon around all through the night until it went to bed in the morning. And so I'd kind of be triangulating a location every 20 minutes all through the night to get tracks of how the raccoons were actually moving around. And then I kind of overlay the movements of the raccoons and their habitat use with where the turkeys were nesting, because obviously I could find turkey nests and do habitat selection on the turkey nests. To kind of answer the question of, what is the overlap between raccoons when they're foraging and where turkeys are nesting? So you might imagine, wow, if like raccoons are a real big predator, it might be because, for whatever reason, either because the way the land is managed and fragmented, or just because of dumb luck, that, okay, well, it's the turkeys are nesting where the raccoons are foraging, and that's a problem, or not. It turned out it was kind of exactly the opposite. So in that landscape, a foot or two of elevation can make a big difference in habitat in that landscape with the flooding. And so during the turkey nesting time, what I actually found was that the turkeys were nesting generally in the highest spots, highest being a relative term in this area. But, the high spots, the dry spots that weren't getting flooded, normally they try to be somewhere near an opening. There wasn't a lot of openings, but there were, pipeline right-of-ways and a few food plots and some public lands. And so the turkeys would generally be up in the higher elevation, dry spots. The raccoons, when they were foraging, this was the time of year when things were flooding and crayfish were really abundant in sort of the ephemerally flooded areas. That's where the raccoons were doing all their eating. Like I could map out a raccoon's path, and then I'd go out in the woods a day or two later and I'd physically kind of walk the path, and they were just going from like pool, and you'd find just crawfish skeletons everywhere, and then you go, oh, there's this next pool and there's crawfish skeletons everywhere. So kind of the take home was, this is a little more complicated than we think it is, like it always is, especially with predation. It's, the raccoons, they're not getting a search image where they're looking for turkey nests. It's just, they're foraging in totally different habitats. So we don't have that fear of like, oh God, maybe we can do something to alter this to get the raccoons away from where the turkeys are. The raccoons aren't targeting where the turkeys are. Now, I'm sure raccoons are occasionally stumbling stumbling upon where turkeys
Mm-hmm.
are. But there's not this big overlap between, okay, raccoons forage here, or raccoons are getting this search image to look for a nest because they've got so much food in that habitat system that it would be kind of silly to waste all that energy potentially looking for a turkey nest when I could just go over here, close my eyes, and just grab fistfuls of crayfish.
Yeah.
Yeah. So do you think that that's something that's unique to that landscape because there is so much alternative prey that they prefer more highly, or do you think that there's any of those results that are transferable to other ecosystems?
It's hard to say exactly. I would be careful transferring anything from one ecosystem directly to another, like in any situation.
Right.
Like if you look at some of my shark papers, that's like the point of the shark papers is, well, the Makos in the Gulf of Mexico and the ones off New England are doing totally different things, you know? So in systems where you've got maybe like a lot of bottomland area, a lot of ephemeral areas where there's these alternate food sources, raccoons are super generalists. They're kind of like turkeys. They're probably foraging there. And more upland systems, there might be more overlap just because of the way things shake out. So I'd say in that system, that's that result. But I wouldn't necessarily take those results and then put that in an agricultural system in Nebraska and be like, that's how it's working here.
Right.
Yeah. Makes sense. I don't know, I've kind of gotten fascinated listening to you and running through some questions that I'm realizing I don't know about raccoons. Because I don't want it to be about the whole episode to be about raccoons, but I do think it's relevant.
If it turns into that, that's fine.
Since there's so many people are thinking about raccoons when they're thinking about turkeys, like you said. I was curious, how many places do they roost in? Like how repeatable is the behavior? Are they walking down the same, is the same raccoon using the same trails and hunting the same pools night after night? Or are they really variable? What does that look like from a spatial ecology standpoint?
Where I was working, their home ranges were actually pretty small. So, they wouldn't necessarily repeat the same exact thing every night, but if I had a raccoon that I tracked for a few nights over the course of a month, like one or two of those nights would be potentially really similar. So I'm sure they kind of cycle around. They know their home range. It's the whole point of making a home range is you get the familiarity with it. So they kind of know, I'll forage here. And then I'm sure there's probably some aspect of this big cool ecological question to look at is that they probably, to avoid totally wiping out an area, probably kind of cycle through the food spots they know in their landscape.
So, are you talking, when you say pretty small, is that a few acres or, tens of acres or hundreds?
Oh man, I got to remember these numbers. This was a while ago.
Well, I don't mean to put you on the spot. I'm just curious because I don't know.
You didn't tell them to come prepared to talk about raccoons today.
I mean, I could look up some papers, but that doesn't make I'd say so during that time of year, and I'm really bad at conceptualizing the size of an acre.
Well, yeah, you can give us hectares if you want to. That's fine.
I will say their home ranges were much smaller than the turkey home ranges.
Right.
Yeah.
By
so
a
maybe
large
tens of acres.
Yeah, I'd say tens to acres.
Yeah.
I mean, I've seen some numbers before.
For that particular time of year. It changes kind of seasonally. In the winter, it'd be a little bigger, and then in the summer, it would shrink down really small because they've got just elderberries everywhere. You have to really just find them
that makes sense.
You'd find an edge where there's elderberries, and they would just be I can almost walk up to my radioed ones. They'd just be sitting in the bushes, just gorging on elderberries.
Yeah. Are they really territorial, or do they just kind of ignore each other?
In that landscape, they were not territorial at all.
That's what I figured.
High density, and I guess with all the food availability, there was no reason to be super territorial. I imagine in other landscapes, I think there's been some work way back up in the Dakotas that found that the males would have big territories and be very territorial. But if you look at the distribution of resources for a raccoon in some place like the prairie potholes of North Dakota, it's really spread out. So.
So Mike, one of the other things that I wanted to ask you about while we have you here, and just if it's too far back in history or whatever, that's fine. You may not remember all the details, but You were the lead author on a really interesting paper about density dependence in turkeys several years ago. And I wondered, if your thoughts on density dependent have changed, or if you still think that, that is one of these other factors that we've been talking about that are affecting turkey population dynamics.
I would say that it is a factor, but the way it operates is still a bit of a question mark. So even in that paper, we had put that as sort of like, here's a potential mechanism that may be explaining some of the trends we're seeing.
Sure.
And that was, I guess, to explain to the audience, if they're not familiar, when we say density dependence, this is, how a population can only expand to what the resource is limited to, right? So the density dependence is this case as the density of a population increases, so as there's more individuals over time, eventually you kind of hit a ceiling, and it sort of levels out or drops the population down to a sustainable level. And this is something we see in pretty much every species on planet Earth, give or take.
Principle of ecology.
Yeah.
And I think y'all hypothesized in that paper that it could be the availability of quality nesting areas that was one of the limiting factors operating. Is that right?
That was one of the hypotheses we put out there.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that could be. So since that paper, we kind of put that out as like, on a very large scale, this is a potential mechanism. So what you would expect with density dependence, and part of the reason I got thinking on that line was you would expect to see strong population growth over time, population increasing, and then eventually you hit a point where you'd see the population sort of start to fall down, or start to fall down and stabilize, or kind of do this oscillating. It's really hard to explain this on a podcast, but population goes up for a little while, down for a little while. It's sort of around a mean level, and that's kind of what we saw. Like if you really step back and look at the turkey trends, you have a lot of places where they put in all this effort into restoring the turkeys and reintroducing turkeys, right? So you kind of introduce this bird on the landscape. It was in some cases reintroducing birds where there was no competition from other turkeys, and so you saw over a few decades these giant population expansions. And then in a lot of states, and it's kind of cool because it's sort of offset by different states depending on when they really started their restoration.
Yeah,
those trends states that had started later, when I did that study, were still in the upward swing, where some states like Missouri and others that had started restoration earlier had kind of reached that stabilization level. And that's kind of what you'd expect how density dependent would operate on the population growth. It would grow until it reaches the limiting capacity of the environment, and then it would drop down, and it would sort of stabilize around a mean level. And I'd be confident that operates on wild turkey populations like it does on many other species. The questions are, to what extent and what are the mechanisms, and I would not expect those to necessarily be the same in every location in every system.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
so in some cases it could be the limiting factor could be quality nest sites. The limiting factor could be something related to nest density and predator density. It could be related to forage availability, not necessarily even during the nesting, but maybe winter forage availability. Like there's a lot of things that could be the limiting factor in a given landscape. So I'm sure it's effects to some reason, but you'd have to really study it dedicated in one area to figure out where the limiting factors might be in a given system. So,
well, I think one of the reasons that paper has remained a part of the conversation all these years later, and what really draws me to it, is that we see turkey populations oftentimes as indexed by harvest declining across such a broad geographic scale that are representative of such a great diversity of ecosystems, right, and land uses and all that kind of thing. And that was, one of the few hypotheses that I've seen proposed that is somewhat of a unifying theme that explains what's going on across such a large geographic scale.
Yeah, it does seem to really well represent the gamut, and with a few tweaks, like when did the restoration start? It really does align pretty well, it seems like, for me as well. I really enjoy that paper and refer to it commonly. one thing I wanted to just kind of throw in, Mike, and we'll see what you think about it. When we were at the turkey working group recently, one of the biologists, the one from Virginia, brought up just sort of an anecdote that was really interesting to me, and it piqued my interest. It was not the focus of his talk, but he just kind of mentioned it while he was up there. But they had a cicada hatch in a couple of their counties, and 2 years later, the harvest went up 50% in those counties. When the hatch from that year would have been 2 years old. And then we brought it up on the air, and then 2 or 3 people sent us
from different
information from different states. One of them was at the state level, saying that they had similar observations, not just from the harvest 2 years later, but also in the poult per hen ratios the same year when they had a big cicada eruption. And then I started thinking, wow, that sounds, one potential hypothesis is that there's a food limitation, at least with insects. So it's curious that you're studying that aspect in your comprehensive study. It makes me wonder, is that something that's limiting populations? And then you don't have a food limitation anymore during the cicada hatch, and then you see this really big upturn in reproduction. It seems now, after we brought that up, and multiple states have come back to us with people, showing us data, it seems to be a pretty consistent pattern across, the Appalachians and the Central Hardwoods region. So I found that really curious, and I guess a competing hypothesis that's been brought up several times, including by the turkey biologist there in Missouri. He emailed us about this. Another potential is a lot of the generalist predators might prey switch, which could relieve turkeys of some predation as well. So, in other words, for the audience out there, raccoon might be keen to eat eggs unless there's cicadas laying around everywhere, and then it just may eat all cicadas and not worry about turkey nests. So a lot of things going on there, and I don't know if that was really a question for you, but I thought you might find it interesting, and I'm definitely interested to hear you respond.
Could be both.
Yeah.
That's kind of cool, though. If you had I bet we could write this paper, actually. If it's been documented, I'm sure people track exactly where the cicadas were each year. I bet we could match that up with poult per hen ratios collected by state agencies and harvest numbers. I bet we could actually quantify that.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. No, I already have the cicada hatch data, actually.
There you go.
And in fact, Mike, as part of your ongoing study, I think it would be really interesting if next year you see any differences in vital rates. And I don't know if it's but apparently the Great Southern Cicada Brood is supposed to hatch next year. It's a 13-year hatch. And the Great Southern Brood includes at least a portion of Missouri. I don't know if it's the portion that you're working in, but it would be really interesting to see if you pick that up in the data.
It would be. Probably not. We're basically on the Iowa border.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's super cicada-y. But maybe we can collect a bunch of them and just drop them, just see Putnam County with cicadas.
I like it. Hey, experimental manipulation.
Make it experimental,
Yeah, I really like experiments, personally.
Apparently crickets are cheaper. I don't know, but somebody told me.
We could just grow a bunch of crickets and throw them up.
Yeah.
Man, how many times does that come up? It's just, a lot of folks have told us about the crickets.
Yeah. So one way to test the density dependence, it would be hard. It would require a lot of time. But one way to do it would be to find an area where you can manipulate the turkey population. So find an area, maybe an area where people don't hunt so they won't get annoyed at you. That's study it for a year or two, right? Try to get an idea of the population size, reproduction, and then go in there and just wipe the turkey population down to 25% of what it was, and then just track it for a decade or two, and see, okay, do you see that pattern of, okay, it increases and then it hits that oscillation point? But
I hear what you're saying, Mike. I don't know if that's going to be digestible for people, but what if we did it the opposite way, where we have some turkeys and then we come in and put
we increase the carrying capacity.
4 times as many in there to Could we test it
that
way? People might jump on that wagon a little quicker.
Well, you could do both, right? If you had two study areas, in one area you could take the birds and put them in another area. So there we go.
That would be the way to do it. And even if you could have some sort of crossover design where you're tracking the reproduction change.
Yeah.
Yeah, it would be really difficult to do, but I start getting excited when we start talking about experiments like that, and you're manipulating and trying to isolate variables.
Yeah, this is why when people do these experiments with these type of ecology studies, it's on like insects.
It's like aphids and
little labs. Yeah, so we can
like
actually create a landscape and experimentally manipulate it and get a result within a year.
Right.
Yeah. A little more difficult with turkeys.
Maybe we can get Jeff Bezos to fund that study.
Yeah, maybe so. Yeah. He's been emailing me about turkeys.
That's the kind of funding it's going to take.
We're going to need a kickback from Amazon.
It's fun. We just go to some area and just tell people outside all turkey limits are abolished for the next year.
the turkey purge.
Yeah. Any method, any time of year.
Yeah. Well, if there's anybody out there that would like for us to come trap all of their turkeys and take them away, y'all can email us. I don't think we're going to get any emails on that one.
I bet East Texas would take them.
Yeah. Well, we do move turkeys around a fair amount still.
Yeah.
For restoration efforts. So it's not entirely out of the question that something like that could be accomplished, especially with adding the turkeys, especially if you have a site where you're going to add them over multiple iterations, you could potentially start getting at that.
Yeah. Probably be a site where there's already an established population, because you got to get above that, right? There's like the limit where they stop growing, and then there's the limit where if they haven't reached that point, they're just going to go extinct.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that was what was really interesting to me, kind of get back on topic about that paper, is that y'all were able to show that as the population increased, there were several metrics that decreased. Primarily, I think it was actually poult per hen stayed the same, but it was the poult number of hens without poults that increased, right?
I think that's right.
It's been a while.
So it was showing that the hens who were successful were still having about the same number of poults. It was just that you had a lot of hens that weren't having poults, or that were not successfully able to raise a brood. And it also, I believe, showed that adult female survival was higher, had been increasing over time.
We did see, So I don't remember.
We'll link the paper in the show notes. People can read it.
Yeah,
I can't remember the details either.
there was, what I thought was really interesting was, like, it's hard to gauge abundance from hunting indices, because that is so. It is so tied to how much people were hunting and what they reported, and was it just a bad weather year, and it was just turkey season that year was just crappy, or is it
changes in
turkey hunter numbers have decreased and it looks like the population's declining just because there's just fewer people out there to hunt.
That's a good point.
So one of the things we did was, there's the breeding bird survey, which the USGS does every year, which is not geared towards turkeys necessarily, but it's there's all these routes throughout the country where volunteers go and they run these routes, and every half mile they stop and they just identify every bird that they hear and see. And the USGS uses this to track, population changes of every type of bird over time. So it's funny when you looked at the, abundance based, just like the hunter indices, those would show these declines at some years, but the breeding bird survey, which is just birders out there looking for turkeys, those were just going up and up and up and up.
Yeah.
But when I plotted out the breeding bird survey data with like the reproduction data, it was like a perfect negative correlation. There was more people, more birders observing turkeys. The poult per hen ratios were like consistently lower.
Wow.
So it's kind of a trade-off. Some people I feel like you can maximize reproduction, or you can maximize population size, but there's a point where you can't do both.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, that's something that the deer community has been struggling with, and trying to weighed pros and cons on for many, many years.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What level to manage the population at.
Like when you look at fisheries, that there's the idea of the maximum sustainable yield, where that's baked into fisheries management, that the highest reproduction occurs when the population is at half of the carrying capacity, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what you expect. That's where fisheries management, they say, okay, we want to be able, for like big industrial fisheries, they want to fish up to about 50% of the population down, because then they'll get the highest amount of reproduction the next year, which is like so you can take the largest amount of fish sustainably, right? So it's baked into the whole thing of, well, when you're not at carrying capacity, you're going to get the highest amount of reproduction. So when the population's small, you'd expect the population to increase and reproduction to increase until you get about 50% of the carrying capacity. Then you expect, okay, the population might still increase for a bit, but that reproduction is going to stabilize or decrease. So,
right. Yeah, it continues to increase, but at a decreasing rate.
Yeah.
And it's kind of interesting. You talked about some hens reproducing and others not. That could be the thing, and that might get to you think about the turkey population, you think about how many poults a single female has. And to keep a population stable, like at the end of the year, the number of new poults just has to equal the number of adults that kind of died, right? To keep it stable. So not every turkey needs to be producing full brood every year to keep a population stable. To get a population to grow, you want to have a lot more. But, just to keep it stable, there's a slightly lower. Not every hen has to be successful all the time when the population is pretty high.
Sure.
We also found the reason I went on that little tangent was you were talking about some hens having poults and others not. I had published a study that was in the last turkey symposium, where I kind of collated some data from the Southeast for birds that we had 2 years of nesting data on. And initially I was trying to get at like nest site or nest patch fidelity. But the interesting thing that came out of that was the birds, these are birds we have 2 consecutive years of data on where they nested and if they were successful or not. If birds in the first year successfully hatched the nest, they had about a 60% chance of being successful in the next year. The birds that were not successful that first year, that had like a 10 or 20% chance of being successful. So it kind of seems like there's some females that just know what they're doing, and they might be responsible for a lot of reproductive output in some populations. So there might be these key females that are really responsible for a lot of the reproduction. It's a hypothesis.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It just shows you why this is so complicated.
For sure.
It's like you're trying to work.
And so that's why just killing all the raccoons is not necessarily the silver bullet.
Yeah. That's a good point.
Wild Turkey Science is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network and is made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow, a grassroots organization dedicated to the wild turkey. To learn more about TFT, check out turkeysfortomorrow.org.